From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st Show. I'm Brian Mackey. For years, the U.S. Census Bureau has been projecting that sometime in the 2040s, America will become a minority-majority country. Put another way, that would be the first time that white people who are not Hispanic would be less than 50% of the population, and thus a majority of Americans would identify as Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, etc. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is actively fighting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in multiple parts of our society, from private corporations to public schools. For example, this year the Department of Education announced an investigation of DEI programs at the Chicago public schools, among many others. But even while all this is going on, there are still teachers and school administrators arguing for the importance of diversity in the classroom. For years, Northern Illinois educators Maurice McDavid and Lizette Jacobson have hosted a podcast about all this. It's called Black, Brown, and Bilingue. Maurice is the principal of DeKalb's new Dr. Leroy A. Mitchell Elementary School, while Lizette is director of curriculum for multilingual services in Huntley, Illinois. And this year they published their first book together. It's called Your Words Are Fire, 10 Culturally Responsive Teaching Strategies to Speak the Language of Belonging and Help Students Learn, Express Ideas, and Solve Problems. As you might deduce from the title, the book is aimed at teachers, but there's enough going on around these topics that we thought it would be of interest to people outside the profession. Maurice McDavid and Lizette Jacobson join me now. Hello, welcome back to the 21st Show.
Thank you so much for having us.
And listeners, you're welcome to join us today at 800-222-9455. That's 800-222-9455. All right, Maurice, I'm going to start with you, and let's start with something that's right there in the title of the book, culturally responsive teaching. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think really has its origins in the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is a professor emeritus, I believe, at University of Wisconsin-Madison. But she started some of this research in the 80s and really went to try to find out who was having success with students of color and what was it that they were doing. And kind of what she discovered is what she termed culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy. And so it's taken on a few different forms since then, but the way that we really talk about it is really a high emphasis on academic rigor and achievement, as well as the ability to understand both your own cultural perspective and at least one other, right, to understand that lens. And then thirdly, it really lands on the ability to critique society and look for ways to make it better. So whether that's about justice or equity and all of its different forms.
Lizette, how does let's talk about something you tackle right at the beginning of the book, which is how language shapes our sense of self and the world around us.
Yes, so when I was a little girl, I always think back to being in the second grade. And like many kids, I absolutely adored my teachers. I loved being in school. And ultimately, I do believe that education is the great equalizer. But I do mention in the book a particular incident that made me become aware of my linguistic identity, and that is when I walked into the classroom to be an interpreter for my dad at a parent-teacher conference. And it was in that moment that I realized that something was different about me because my father and my teacher could not communicate. And it left a lasting impression on me because I clearly loved my teacher and I adore my dad. But this kind of embarrassed me, and I didn't have the words or the understanding as a child. But I do remember making a very conscious effort of separating my home identity and my school identity, which ultimately I believe led to limited experiences in terms of my education because, again, I wanted to keep those worlds separate. And I always tell educators this part. My teacher did not make any disparaging comments. It was the lack of her at least affirming and acknowledging what I was doing. Because for young children to be put in very adult situations is scary, it is stressful. And so I would have loved if my teacher could have been like, wow, look at you go using all of your linguistic repertoire. I mean, I wouldn't have understood that, right? But yeah, so that really left a mark on me.
It's interesting. You say you were embarrassed. Why do you think that was? Or what do you understand about that now, right?
Yeah, what I understand about that now is that English is a language of status. And so Spanish, on the other hand, particularly with all of the political noise and just what we know has happened over time, it just does not have that same status that English does. And so I internalized it.
Maurice, talk about what someone could lose if they feel like they have to talk, a particular way to get ahead in life.
Yeah, I think what you lose is really just that ability to bring your full, authentic self to whether that be the workplace or to an educational setting. Similarly to Lisette, I share a story at the beginning of the book talking about my recognition of that linguistic identity and being told that I spoke white, right? And what that meant, right, is and how it carried this concept of it was the correct way of speaking, it was standard American English, it was all of these different pieces, and again, it brings with it a certain status, but it also brings then a disconnect to my racial identity, right? And so I think sometimes what we lose is that ability to bring our authentic selves into those spaces, and again, when we think about the power of diversity in a workplace, you don't necessarily need, right, a whole bunch of people all thinking exactly the same way. You need people who can bring a different perspective and challenge, and sometimes that is silenced by being asked to fit into this box and be this certain way or do this certain thing.
So, Lizette, do you think our schools have done a good job, or how would you rate the job that our schools have done, preparing Americans for this, the multicultural future we're headed for, and frankly, the multicultural present we're in now?
That is an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I've ever been asked that before, but I will say that we have seen it come and go in waves where the history of multicultural education in this country, it's just like it just like I said, it comes in waves. And so I don't know that I would say we've done a good job or a bad job. I think there's just more room for growth, particularly in terms of language, because Maurice and I reference in the book that linguistic identity is just, if not more important than some of your ethnic or racial identities, because it is the way that we communicate with one another. And that is one area where I think American educators could use some additional, perhaps, understanding, professional development on how linguistics work and why linguistics matters.
All right, let me take a moment to reintroduce our conversation. If you're just joining us, it's the 21st show. We are talking with Lizette Jacobson and Maurice McDavid. They're both educators, or I guess school administrators at this point. Lizette is director of curriculum in Huntley, School District 158. I should say director of curriculum for multilingual services in Huntley. And Maurice McDavid is the principal of Dr. Leroy A. Mitchell Elementary School in DeKalb. And more to the point for our conversation, they are the co-authors of the book, Your Words Are Fire, 10 Culturally Responsive Teaching Strategies to Speak the Language of Belonging and Help Students Learn, Express Ideas, and Solve Problems. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through the subtitle before the end of the show. If you want to join us today, 800-222-9455. If you have experience, maybe you or someone in your life had experience in the education system coming from a background that was different from your teacher, linguistically or in other ways. Let us know what that was like for you, how that affected your education. 800-222-9455. All right, Maurice, I'm going to read a short passage from the book. One might assume that students who speak English as their first or even second language come to school ready to learn from English-speaking teachers. A second part of this assumption is that if educators speak the same language as students in front of them, the educators are ready to teach those students. Both assumptions are false, you write. Why is that?
Yeah, so I think we tend to generalize English as if you are English speaking, you are English speaking, and yet we are fully aware, particularly those folks who study linguistics, and I don't count myself to be an expert in linguistics generally, but someone who has done a lot of study and particularly seen its application in schools. But thinking about, right, the idea of all of the multiple dialects of English or even vernacular. And so I'll give you a quick example here. Many students coming from African American homes may come in speaking some form of African American vernacular English. And that may include things like dropping the G off of gerunds when they are speaking. Or, for example, the habitual be, which is, oh man, yeah, she always be over at that person's house, right? And so those are rules. Those are things that vernacular uses with consistency, but it does differ from standard American English, which is what we are needing to teach in schools. And so sometimes that assumption that somebody's coming in because they speak English, they don't necessarily need any linguistic support, right, is incorrect because maybe they do. Maybe they need some help transitioning from, oh, okay, when I'm speaking, I may say talk in, but I need to write talking and I'll read talking. And then on the flip side of that, teachers, again, oftentimes are not thinking about those things, or if they are, they're thinking about those things as deficits as opposed to an asset, right? And I'll give you again just a quick example because I'm a talker, so I'll share this and then I'll let you move forward here. But that habitual be, there's a really interesting study that was done where they had a group of students, and some of the students were white and some of the students were black, and they showed them a picture, I should say, of Elmo eating a cookie and of Cookie Monster, just a picture of him. And they asked the students who is eating a cookie. And all of the students agreed that Elmo is eating a cookie. But then they asked the students, and who be eating cookies? And many of the white students were like, Elmo? But the black students understood that Cookie Monster be eating cookies, using that habitual
Yeah.
be for something that they do on a regular basis, right? And so being able to see that as an asset and utilizing it to build additional language, as opposed to needing to tear down language.
If it's not out of line, I feel you exactly on that. He'd definitely be eating cookies on the regular.
On the regular, I love it.
So, I mean, Lizette, how do you get teachers to meet students where they are then, right? Get them on the right track.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're hoping with this book is just having a paradigm shift, right? Understanding that language is how learning happens. All thinking is mediated through language. So if we ignore students' home languages or dialects, we are essentially ignoring their thinking tools. Brain science confirms this. It builds on prior knowledge and neural networks. And so we do reference some of the brain research because as Maurice and I, we deliver professional development in different school districts. And what we notice is that it is this work in terms of like equity and culturally responsiveness is seen as like fluffy work, as if there isn't real science research to support it. And so I think once teachers start to see the science of learning in action through culturally responsive strategies, I think that is how we can get them to see, this is really something we can leverage for all of our students.
So, what are some of what are a couple of suggestions you would make, Lizette, to teachers who are looking? And I should say we need to take a break in about a minute here, so maybe just we can get a sort of a taste and then come back and talk more about it. But a couple of suggestions you'd make to teachers who are looking to be more inclusive in terms of language in the classroom.
I mean, I think the lowest hanging fruit is have print in different languages around your classroom, right? And so that naturally lends itself to a conversation with your students. What do you notice about that writing system? Kids are extremely curious. So that is one that we reference in the book. Another one would be using some multilingual strategies such as contrastive analysis, so putting the languages side by side and noticing changes or similarities are really, really effective tools to get students thinking about language.
All right, we are going to continue this conversation after a break. We're talking with Lizette Jacobson and Maurice McDavid, co authors of the book Your Words Are Fire 10 Culturally Responsive Teaching Strategies to Speak the Language of Belonging and help students learn, express ideas, and solve problems. If you want to join us today, 800 222 9455 is the number to join the 21st show. Today, again, 800 222 9455. We're going to continue this conversation after a short break. This is the 21st show.
Support for the 21st show comes from listeners like you and the Des Moines Arts Center, located in Iowa's capital city, featuring works by regional, national, and international artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. Details are at DesMoinesArtsCenter.org.
It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are talking with two educators from Northern Illinois. Maurice McDavid is the principal at the Dr. Leroy A. Mitchell Elementary School in DeKalb, and Lizette Jacobson is director of curriculum for multilingual services in the Huntley School District. They are the co-hosts of a podcast called Black, Brown, and Bilingue, and they are the co-authors of a new book called Your Words Are Fire, 10 Culturally Responsive Teaching Strategies to Speak the Language of Belonging and Help Students Learn, Express Ideas, and Solve Problems. It's really aimed at teachers, but DEI is so much in the conversation these days with the Trump administration doing everything it can to end DEI programs in not just elementary and secondary schools, but universities, even private corporations, and certainly in the federal government. We thought it would be an interesting conversation to hear how people are making an argument for some of these practices, inclusion in particular, in schools. 800-222-9455 if you want to join us today. 800-222-9455. Maurice, can I ask you to talk about the idea of code switching and how that plays into this conversation? Is what is the goal of education today, right? Is it to get people so that they can, speak the way they're comfortable speaking, but also, speak and write in a way, as you say, that meets standardized testing requirements and expectations of whatever corporations would have? Or, are we trying to move beyond that in society in some way? Where are things headed?
Yeah, you just put all of the complexity right out there in that question, right? I think that that's some of the issues with code switching. We, have really kind of landed on a couple of ideas connected to code switching. Number one, we wish that we lived in a world where it was not necessary. However, being two people of color, having grown up in this world, millennials, we recognize that it is probably still a place where it is necessary. And so we talk about it, and we talk about both of those being able to still be true to yourself, and just finding the different words, or different style to say it. What I will say is, I think additionally, we we code switch in more ways than just thinking about our racial setting, or our racial identity and the setting in which we're working. I oftentimes talk about the idea that when I am leading service at my church, I am using different language than when I'm leading a staff meeting at my school building than when I'm kicking it on the weekend with friends. And so understanding that all of those are part of me, I think the issue, right, with code switching is when it is necessitated, when people feel like I cannot, bring any other additional language unless or I can't have success, I should say, unless I speak this one certain way. And so we definitely, we talk about it directly with our students at my school building, and we have recommended the same as we've gone and worked with other schools.
Yeah, certainly. Believe it or not, I don't sound like a public radio host 24/7. Let's talk about some of the other obstacles in putting all this into practice. You have a critique in modern education that schools are teaching to the test, right? Standardized tests. How do you integrate some of what we've been talking about into the classroom curriculum when tests are such a prominent part of K-12 education?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that we address through one of the hacks in our book is really considering the multiple modalities for student assessment. That we all know that there are people who simply are not good test takers. We know that oftentimes, especially paper and pencil tests, fill in the bubble tests, are written, unfortunately, with bias in them. And so we talk about what are the multiple ways that you can assess student learning that does not require just a paper and pencil test, whether that be writing, speaking, group projects, some of those, a variety of things. And I recognize that in saying that, we're not saying anything that's earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but it is something for us to always be coming back to, particularly when you consider two other factors that are often tied into language, one of which is the concept of collectivism versus individualism. America as a country tends to be very individualistic. There's a study that says, that really as a country we're the most individualistic, but we are serving students that are coming from more of a collectivist background, where that it's not just about what I know and what I do, but what we can produce together. And the truth is that oftentimes in the work that we do, right, the reality is that we are working collaboratively because, right, even this radio show you're hosting, but you've got a producer and you've got somebody checking the sounds, and how are we working together as a team, right, to bring what we know and produce something good. The second part, though, right, is again, I think in terms of the language, part of that is just really emphasizing, in terms of assessment, not just I've memorized this for right now, but I've learned to be able to talk about it in a way that is effective in demonstrating my learning.
Lizette, there's a part of each chapter in the book that talks about some of the pushback teachers might face, or maybe just feel internally as they look at putting some of these ideas into practice. Talk about some of the suggestions you offer to counter that.
When we set out to write the book, we knew that language and equity as a whole is something that is controversial. And so we wanted to get ahead of it. And that's really how the Hack Learning series that we're a part of, our book is a part of the Hack Learning series through Times 10 publication. But they really endeavor, and we really endeavored to write a very practical book that kind of we wrote it with that in mind. And so some of the things that we mention as potential barriers are things such as, well, students have to perform at standard American English, so why am I even going to bother tapping into that background knowledge when I know they have to teach or be able to perform on this test? Um, Another thing, you may not have the support of your admin or your district. It really does depend on where you work. But we have seen how language has been politicized, and so we do know that there are educators everywhere who are even facing barriers that are put up by their own administration or perhaps even the community. We're not blind to that fact, but we hope that whatever is in the book is going to be helpful for all of you.
Let me ask. We asked members of our texting group about some of these ideas, and we got a message from John in Urbana. He says DEI might work best as a mindset or culture of radical inclusion, lifting up those who don't fit the mold, but can help the organization grow and change and communicate more broadly. John says, I'm skeptical that this can be done using any set criteria without unintended consequences. In higher education, for instance, some of the biggest gaps are based in class. A lot of it is in how you talk and dress, and of course, coming from a culture that prioritizes college. And John says white, rural, and working class people are rarely even in the pipeline. End quote. Maurice, I wonder, what is your response to that?
Well, I think particularly right there at the end, he hit something on the head. When we talk about language in particular, I really like to emphasize the idea that while we tend to kind of put diversity, equity, and inclusion into race, language, and class, those things are very much so an important part of this conversation. So, for example, while I reference African American vernacular English, there is also right. Chicano English. There is also, various dialects spoken by people, for example, in West Virginia, spoken in the South. Jeff Foxworthy, well-known comedian from the early 2000s, was quoted as saying, anytime somebody heard him speak with a Southern accent, they wanted to deduct 100 points from his IQ. And the truth of the matter is that as we think about language, right, it gives us an opportunity to think more broadly than just race or ethnicity, right? But what are the ways in which we have centered and uplifted just this one particular way of speaking, right? And who fits into that mold, and how can we break that mold and let some more folks in, right? Because there are highly intelligent people who have a Southern accent or who sound like they're from the mountains of West Virginia or who sound like they're from, inner city Chicago or, whatever that may be, right? We have tied value to it and tied those things to it. So I think that's one part. I think in terms of, kind of looking at it being for a whole organization, I think as an organization, it has to be not only a mindset, but that's fine to have those standards. What are the things that we're working for here? And then how are those standards inclusive? Right. So both things can be true. I don't think that DEI is a request to move standards. I think that concept is rooted in the idea that certain people from certain groups just won't measure up to the standard. And I would call that racist or linguist or whatever it is, some type of an ism where we have already presumed that in order for that person to have made it here, we had to lower the standard for them to get here, and that's problematic thinking.
Let me take a moment to remind listeners this is the 21st show. We are talking with Maurice McDavid and Lizette Jacobson. They are both educators in Northern Illinois. Maurice is a school principal. Lizette is director of curriculum for multilingual services, and they're the co-author of the book Your Words Are Fire, which is about it's part of a series of books aimed at helping teachers do better in the classroom. And this one is focused specifically on culturally responsive teaching strategies around language. Lizette, let me ask you, I wonder if you ever get pushback from teachers themselves, right? A lot of them feel under-resourced, possibly also underpaid. They've got their own families and things to worry about. Like, how do you get them to buy into, this idea that they should also be learning about, how kids acquire language, for example?
That's an excellent question. One that we reference often is, you know, language is extremely dynamic. It changes, it evolves, and now with social media and social media culture, we see that that rate of change is exponential. So showing them, you could either be in one school of thought or the other, but the fact of the matter is that language changes. I give them the examples of how the words like piano, zoo, bus were once upon a time considered slang because the actual full word is pianoforte, omnibus, and zoological garden. And so once you start to really highlight and you remove some of the identity politics we find ourselves in today, and just from a very like universal level, and this understanding of like kids are coming up with new phrases all the time. This youth culture has really fed into that. And so once you say that, I think they start to get a little disarmed and a little more trusting. Because I think most people, when they attend our sessions, or if they pick up the book, or if I'm delivering a session around multilinguals, that's typically what they think of. Now, because I don't know if it's because of my specific role, but I actually see teachers who want to be able to spend more time talking about language and actually tapping into their students' linguistic repertoire so that they can then design their instruction. What they're feeling the pressure is of like having to keep up with the scope and sequence and going into the depth of whatever unit of study they're going into. And so that is
So it's
a
Maurice's fault. It's the
common
principal's fault.
barrier I see. Hmm.
Exactly, exactly.
What about parents, Lizette? Do you have to? I mean, is buy-in from parents an important part of this story?
Absolutely. What I am seeing an uptick in is parents. So in the state of Illinois, we have a home language survey that asks, is there another language spoken in the home? And then does the child speak another language other than English? And if you respond yes to either of those questions, you are considered an English language learner. And so I am noticing an uptick of people maybe not being fully transparent. And so I think, I don't know if it's for fear or, lack of understanding, but more and more parents are marking no for both of those two questions. And so one of my great challenges is actually identifying the right the right students. So the parents, it really has depended, but right now I see that parent buy-in is at an all-time low because of everything else that's going on,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Yeah. Wow. Well, big picture. Just a minute and a half or so left. I mentioned all these attacks on DEI coming out of the federal government. How are you thinking about your work more broadly, Lizette?
Maurice and I actually did talk about this a little bit in one of our episodes, and it's not a shameless plug, but for our podcast. But you know, I think hindsight is always 2020, but there have definitely been some missteps. I think we could have done more. We could have been more intentional about bringing more people along. I think we inadvertently excluded people, especially around language, because like Maurice alluded to earlier, I mean that this is something that impacts students universally. So um, I think that looking back, we could have done a better job. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just the one thing that I keep thinking about
Yeah, Maurice, just
is,
about 30 seconds if you have final thoughts on, how you're thinking about your work as it's being challenged, right, in this way.
Yeah, I think the short version of it is very simply this. I want to show up for my students, for my families, and I just want to do the work um, because I think it's hard to argue against producing an educational system that is good for everyone. And I think one of the things that happened is DEI made some folk believe, oh, that's only for them. But I believe that the work that we're doing is good
mm,
for everyone in the school.
mhm.
Maurice McDavid and Lizette Jacobson are the co-authors of Your Words Are Fire, which is out now from Times 10 Publications. They're also the co-host of Black, Brown, and Bilingue, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for being with us. More to come here on the 21st show. Stay right here.